Hello everybody and welcome to another video, and today it is the 17th of April. Today we're going to be talking more about Bakhmut, and before we begin I want to talk about my thread in relation to Chassis VR, which I posted yesterday, which I linked in the description to my last video. And so in that thread I basically talked about Ukraine's defensive capabilities in Chassis VR and around it, some of the geographical features and some of the man-made features within the city that could be used to their advantage, and some of the ways that Russia could also use the geography in the area to their advantage, because we need to understand that once Bakhmut falls, which it will eventually, the next main defensive node in this general area is Chassis VR for the Ukrainians. And so we've already seen some of their forces coalesce around here. We know that there's some very good positions that they could use to set up defenses over here, and if Russia does want to overcome the multi-layered defenses in Donbass, then at some point they will have to take over Chassis VR. Maybe it won't be directly after they take over Bakhmut. Maybe they'll have a detour and attack some other sector of the front line, but eventually they will have to target Chassis VR in some direction. Even if that means flanking, we still have to look at how that will materialize, and so that's why I tried to account for all those scenarios in my thread. Now, something that was mentioned in the thread that I think is very interesting that I want to mention as well is the fact that Russia, they are now beginning to use a lot of their unguided bombs, these Fab 500s, and they're basically using these precision guidance kits to modify these very antiquated bombs that are very unguided, so it's very hard to target a precise area. It's sort of made up for by the fact that they have a large diameter, but nonetheless, they are unreliable in hitting fortified targets because they won't hit them directly. You can't guarantee that due to any sort of fluctuations in the weather or any sort of troop movement or anything like that. And so now the Russians, they're using basically the Russian equivalent of the JDAM missile kits, and they're using that to sort of supplement these unguided bombs that were created during the Soviet era. And so you have these Fab 500s, which Russia has a lot of. I don't know exact numbers. It could be in the hundreds or maybe in the thousands. I'm not sure exactly. But they're taking these and they're converting them using these kits, and then they're sending them to the front line. So it's estimated that the Fab 500s, about 10 to 20 of them are being sent to the front line every single day for the past few months. And then some of them are getting these different modifications. So because these Fab 500s could be modified now, they've sort of turned into cruise missiles in the sense that they could be fired from distance, and it would be very difficult for Ukraine to intercept because really these are being fired maybe 50 kilometers away from the front line and about maybe 15 kilometers in altitude above ground. And so it would be very difficult for Ukrainian air defense systems, which are not even stationed on the front line. They're probably stationed like more inland. I'm not exactly sure, but if the front line is over here, like in this area, then you probably have air defenses a bit further to the west. So again, it's going to be very difficult for the Ukrainians with their current air defense systems to really do anything about it. They can't intercept the bomb while it's being dropped, and they can't even drop, or they can't even fire upon the Russian Su-34s and the Russian Su-35s, these fourth and fifth generational jets that are carrying and dropping these bombs. They can't even fire them because they're so far away from the front line, which is why Russia has been able to use these modified Fab 500s to really a lethal extent in places like Sumy, where they dropped 11 of these bombs on March 24th, and they were able to destroy some bridges, and there was nothing that Ukraine could do in terms of air defense to prevent this from occurring. And so since then, we've seen Russia really amp up their utilization of the Fab 500s. They've used some around Avdiivka as well. And now we've seen some recorded incidents of this being used in Bakhmut, so we're going to look into that. But again, I want to remind everybody of the modifications that have been added to the Fab 500. And so it's using this aerial guidance kit, which is called in Russia the MPK. So it has also two pop-out main wings that you could see on the left and the right side of the bomb, and it also has these horizontal stabilizers on the top. And these can be added again, as I said, to the previous bombs, and it can be done pretty quickly, if efficiently, even by some trained technicians on the ground or by troops that are trained in doing so. And it's at a relatively low cost. For some perspective, it's about 2 million rubles for each kit, and in dollars, that's $24,000. And so again, these kits, they contain satellite guidance as well, and so that's really the part that gives it a lot of its precision. And then again, it is resistant to some changes in the weather, which is why it has all these different stabilizers. And so it's not just the Fab 500. There's also reports of Russia using the UPAB 1500 for the first time in this war. So I'm pretty sure they used these in Syria against ISIS, but now in Ukraine they're using them as well. This is actually a precision bomb that was, I think, released in 2019, and it uses inertial and GPS guidance to find and pinpoint its target, and it can penetrate very deep layers of fortification, which is why people were talking about it in response to my thread, because I was talking about all these different types of fortifications and these dense apartments and industrial areas and factories that Ukraine could use as defense nodes and firing positions. And so a lot of that would be neutered if Russia was able to launch these glide bombs that were also precise from very far away from the front line, so they can be intercepted and they can land in some of these positions. And I'm using this one as an example, and they can then basically destroy them. They can penetrate a lot of different armor. They can penetrate the concrete that's being built up over there. So any sort of fortifications would really be neutered by that, and it would make defending these areas much more difficult. And we have evidence of this by the fact that there's an 1,100 kilogram warhead on the UPAB 1500. So it is certainly a force to be reckoned with. There's also a smaller version, the UPAB 500. I don't know the numbers on these Russian stockpiles. It could be just like something that you could count on your fingers, so not even 10 of these bombs yet. So Russia's still in the process of developing a lot of them. And then in terms of the kits, they don't have that many kits yet, but they have been amping up production in recent months. So we're certainly going to see more of them in the next few days, next few weeks, months. And as for the UPAB 1500, it also has 3 different modes, which is very interesting. So this is when like the fuse or the ignition would occur. So in one of the modes, there's something called a delayed mode. So basically the bomb would be dropped. So for instance, like on this factory, it could be dropped, and then it wouldn't like explode. Explosion wouldn't occur for at the moment of impact. It would be able to penetrate some of the armor, and then once it would penetrate that, then it would explode, which could put a lot of the Ukrainian troops or equipment that's within the fortifications at danger, because not only would it penetrate their positions, but then they would be totally exposed, and then they would detonate and cause mass casualties and damage. And so yeah, that's a very valid point, and I'm willing to concede that if Russia could mass produce these and begin using them on this front, then it could shift the dynamics of the battle and make it much more difficult for the Ukrainians to defend these areas like they have been previously. And so let's begin with what's going on in Bakhmut now. So since the last update, the Ukrainians have withdrawn from their bulge that I was talking about to the east of the rail line, which is really around here, this area. And so this happened probably because of the fear of encirclement. They withdrew across the rail line. So this is now the front line around here. As again, I said, they're trying to coalesce around the apartment complexes to the east. If you go up, you see that the Russians have made some gains in the northern part of Bakhmut. As we've been saying, they're trying to flank the apartment complexes from the north. And so you can see that the gains today have been concentrated around here. You can see I'm trying to map it out roughly for you. The Russians were able to take over some new apartment buildings, 3 to 4 stories, like I said yesterday. And they've also taken some schools, some supermarkets, some businesses, I believe, that were there. There was a playground that was taken over. And so the front line is generally in this area. It's also running around Crimea Street. And this is due to the fact that the Russians have been able to clear out a lot of the residential areas that are over here. So this entire polygon has been taken over. This was previously contested, and a lot of it was controlled by Ukraine. But the Russians have been able to clear out a lot of it. And as a result, they've approached a very important facility used by the Ukrainians. It's actually multiple facilities, multiple garages and warehouses, where I'm sure you have a lot of Ukrainian forces stored and a lot of their ammunition and equipment stored. And so now the Russians are very close to it. So you could see some fighting going on over here. There's also a lot of shelling going on around here. There was a video posted from one of these warehouses, I don't know which one, which shows Russian artillery firing incendiary munitions onto the Ukrainian positions, which could be highly flammable, and again, that could cause a lot of damage to the infantry. As I previously mentioned, there were strikes that utilized the Fab 500s and probably their precision guide kits. And so there were two that were reported by Russian sources that occurred around Bakhmut. And there's also a photo of one of the mushroom cloud. It was also reported by local sources, even that it was seen, heard from Kramatorsk. And so really it was like a 15-kilometer radius around the nation site where you heard of these local reports. And so most likely this is true, that the Russians actually dropped this. And so according to the Russian sources that were talking about these strikes, one was near the positions of the 241st Brigade. This is Territorial Defense Unit. This one over here. And so they are positioned apparently around Kromove and the supply lines leading into Bakhmut. And so there was a strike in this general area, probably targeting some of the defenses set up around here that are trying to hold the line around the supply lines. And then there was also another strike that occurred around this pond. It was mentioned pond number 8. And so I don't really see any other ponds in northern Bakhmut that could have been referred to that are near the front line. And so I'm assuming that pond number 8 would be this one over here, where you do have, again, as I've talked about before in this video, fierce fighting going on around the apartment buildings. And so it would make sense if there was a precision strike on some Ukrainian positions within a fortified building. Speaking of fortified buildings, there's actually a museum that the Ukrainians blew up while they were retreating from northern Bakhmut. And so this retreat occurred a few days ago, but now we've seen this public video released of the Ukrainians mining the building, which was previously a museum, and then as they withdrew, it blew up. And this is a very good tactic, because as the Wagner troops are trying to clear out the building, the Ukrainians could withdraw and then remotely explode everything in there and kill the Wagner troops as they are entering. So that's a strategy that they've been using, not just in northern Bakhmut, but also in western Bakhmut as they've been retreating. So this is a common theme. So that's all for today. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys later.